My parents drained my trust fund to pay for my sister's dream wedding, then called it family generosity. I didn't fight back. I just looked at my fiancé. He quietly stood up, faced my parents, and everything changed. Hello, folks. My name is Natalie. I'm 29 years old, and for most of my life, I believed my parents treated my younger sister and me differently because she simply needed more help. That's what they always told me. You're stronger. You're more independent. Your sister has always been sensitive. As a little girl, I accepted those explanations without question. If my sister cried over a broken toy, she'd get a new one. If I cried because mine had been taken away and handed to her, I'd hear the same sentence every time. Natalie, you're mature enough to understand. I became mature before I was old enough to understand what that word really meant. By high school, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. When I earned straight A's, my parents smiled and said they were proud. When my sister barely passed her classes, they celebrated because she'd worked so hard. My achievements were expected. Hers were extraordinary. I stopped competing for their attention long before I graduated. Instead, I focused on building a life that didn't depend on their approval. I earned a scholarship, graduated with a business degree, and eventually became a project manager for a software company in Portland. The work was demanding, but I loved it. It gave me something my childhood never had: stability. 3 years ago, I met Ethan. He wasn't the loudest person in any room. He wasn't flashy. He listened more than he spoke, and somehow he always knew exactly what I needed to hear. When I apologized for things that weren't my fault, he'd gently ask, "Why are you apologizing?" I never had a good answer. Being with him slowly made me realize how often I'd spent my life trying to keep everyone else comfortable, even at my own expense. One evening, while we were making dinner together, he asked a question I'd somehow avoided for years. Have your parents always treated your sister differently? I stood there stirring pasta sauce for several seconds before answering. Then I stopped myself. No, I know they have. It was the first time I'd ever admitted it out loud. He walked over, wrapped his arms around me, and quietly said, "You deserved better." No one had ever said that to me before. Not once. A few months later, he proposed during a weekend trip to the Oregon coast. There wasn't a crowd, no photographer hiding in the bushes, just the two of us watching the waves as he got down on one knee. It was perfect. When we told my parents, they seemed happy, at least happy enough. Mom hugged me. Dad shook Ethan's hand. Then, almost immediately, the conversation shifted. So, Mom smiled. Have you heard? Heard what? Your sister's getting married too. I blinked. What? Apparently, my sister Lily had gotten engaged 2 weeks earlier. No one had told me. I laughed awkwardly. I guess congratulations are in order. Mom smiled. Isn't it wonderful? Maybe the two of you can help each other plan. That sentence alone told me everything. Even my engagement had somehow become about my sister. Still, I refused to let it bother me. Planning my wedding with Ethan was one of the happiest times of my life. We wanted something simple: a beautiful outdoor ceremony, close family, close friends, good food, no unnecessary extravagance. Lily wanted the exact opposite. Luxury venue, designer dress, 500 guests, horse-drawn carriage, fireworks. Every week, there seemed to be another expensive idea. Every week, my parents somehow found a way to make it happen. Dad even joked one afternoon, "Good thing weddings only happen once." Ethan glanced at me. Neither of us said anything. About 2 months later, my grandmother invited me to lunch. Halfway through the meal, she casually asked, "Have you looked at your trust fund recently?" I frowned. "My what?" She looked surprised. "The trust your grandfather established for you." I stared at her. "I've never even seen it." She slowly put her fork down. "What do you mean?" "I know Grandpa left something for me before he passed away, but Mom and Dad always said I couldn't access it until I turned 30. Grandma looked genuinely confused. "I thought you'd already started using it." A strange feeling settled in my stomach. After lunch, I called my mother. "Can we talk about Grandpa's trust?" She laughed. "Why?" "Grandma mentioned it today." "Oh." Her voice suddenly became cautious. "We'll explain everything later." That answer didn't sit right with me. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I eventually searched through old paperwork I'd kept from my grandfather's estate. Most of it was legal language I barely understood. But one thing became clear. The trust existed, and it wasn't small. I decided not to jump to conclusions. There had to be a reasonable explanation. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. A week later, my parents invited Ethan and me over for dinner. Lily and her fiancé were already there. Wedding magazines covered the dining table. Fabric samples, venue brochures, guest lists. The entire evening revolved around her wedding. No one asked about ours. Eventually, Dad stood up. I think now's probably the right time. Something in his voice made my stomach tighten. Mom reached across the table and gently placed her hand over mine. Natalie, we need you to understand something. I looked at Ethan. He gave me a reassuring smile. Dad cleared his throat. You know your grandfather always wanted this family to stay together. I nodded slowly. So, he exchanged a quick glance with Mom. We made a decision. What kind of decision? Mom took a deep breath. Your sister's wedding was becoming more expensive than expected. I didn't understand where this was going. Dad continued, we used part of your trust fund. The room became completely silent. I actually thought I'd misheard him. You? What? Mom hurried to explain. It wasn't as bad as it sounds. Dad nodded. It stayed in the family. I looked from one parent to the other. You took money Grandpa left for me, so to pay for Lily's wedding. Mom smiled nervously. When you say it like that, it sounds terrible. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How else am I supposed to say it? Dad leaned forward. We weren't stealing from you. It's family generosity. Family generosity. Those two words echoed in my head. Across the table, Lily didn't look surprised. She didn't even seem uncomfortable. She simply looked down at her plate, as though she'd known all along. I felt strangely calm. Not because I wasn't hurt, because I was more than I'd ever been. But somewhere deep inside, something finally clicked. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't another small example of favoritism. It was years of excuses leading to this exact moment. I slowly looked around the table. My mother looked hopeful. My father looked convinced I'd understand. Lily couldn't even meet my eyes. Then, without saying a single word, I turned my head toward Ethan. He looked at me for one long, quiet moment. His expression didn't show anger. It showed certainty. He gently squeezed my hand beneath the table. Then, he let go and quietly pushed his chair back. The sound of the chair sliding across the hardwood floor seemed louder than anyone's breathing. My parents looked up. Lily finally raised her head. Ethan calmly straightened his jacket. Then he looked directly at my parents. For the first time that evening, he spoke. Sometimes, the person who says the least in the room is the one everyone should be listening to. As Ethan quietly stood up, I realized he wasn't about to comfort me. He was about to say what I'd spent my entire life being too afraid to say. The room was completely silent. Ethan looked at my parents for a long moment before speaking. His voice wasn't raised. It was calm, respectful, but every word landed, with more weight than shouting ever could. Can I ask you both a question? Dad nodded cautiously. Of course. If Lily had inherited that trust fund. He paused. Would you have taken her money to pay for Natalie's wedding? Neither of my parents answered. Mom looked down at the table. Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Ethan waited. After several seconds, he asked again. It's a simple question. Would you have done the same thing to her? The silence gave us the answer. No, Dad finally admitted. Ethan nodded once. Then this isn't family generosity. It's favoritism. The words seemed to hang in the air. Mom immediately shook her head. That's not fair. No? Ethan asked gently. Then help me understand. You kept Natalie believing she couldn't access money that legally belonged to her. You spent part of it without asking, and you expected her to thank you because the money stayed in the family. Mom opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Dad cleared his throat. We always intended to replace it. When? Ethan asked. After the wedding. With what money? Again, silence. I looked at Lily. She still wouldn't meet my eyes. Finally, I spoke. Did you know? Her shoulders slumped. She nodded. I found out a few weeks ago. You knew the money was mine? Another nod. I told Mom and Dad I didn't want to ask questions. I couldn't help laughing. It wasn't funny. It was disbelief. So asking no questions somehow made it acceptable. Tears filled Lily's eyes. I didn't know what to do. You could have said no. She looked away. Dad suddenly leaned forward. This isn't all on Lily. We made the decision. No, I replied quietly. You made the decision. She accepted the benefit. Those aren't the same thing. No one argued. For the first time in my life, my parents had no explanation ready. Ethan reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. I looked at him, confused. When did you? He gave me a small smile. The day after your grandmother mentioned the trust. While I'd been searching through old paperwork, Ethan had quietly contacted an attorney friend who specialized in estate planning, not to start a lawsuit, just to understand our rights. He placed the folder on the table. Our attorney reviewed the trust documents. Dad's face immediately changed. What attorney? The one who explained that trustees have a legal responsibility to act in the beneficiary's best interest. Mom's expression slowly faded. Ethan continued, if trust assets were used for purposes outside the trust agreement without proper authority, There could be serious legal consequences. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for the folder. Finally, Dad spoke. "You're threatening us." "No." Ethan folded his hands. "I'm explaining the situation." Then he looked directly at my parents. "But before Natalie decides what she wants to do, I think she deserves the truth." Dad rubbed his forehead. For the first time all evening, he looked tired instead of confident. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "Then how was it supposed to happen?" I asked. "We thought." He stopped. "We thought you'd understand." I stared at him. "You've said that my entire life." Mom's eyes filled with tears. "We never meant to hurt you." I believe that. They both looked relieved. Then I finished my sentence. "But you were willing to, because hurting me was always easier than disappointing Lily." Neither of them denied it. That hurt more than any argument could have. A week later, my parents asked to meet us again. This time, just the four of us. Mom looked exhausted. Dad placed several documents on the table before anyone spoke. "I've been meeting with the attorney who manages your grandfather's estate." I glanced at Ethan. He remained silent. Dad slid the papers toward me. "The money used for Lily's wedding has been restored." I blinked. "What?" "I took out a home equity loan." Mom quietly added, "And we've resigned as trustees. They'll be replaced by an independent professional until the trust transfers to you." I looked down at the paperwork. Everything appeared official. Everything had already been signed. "I don't understand." Dad let out a slow breath. "When the attorney explained our responsibilities, he also explained how badly we'd failed you." Mom wiped away a tear. "We kept telling ourselves it was temporary. We convinced ourselves we'd fix everything before you ever knew. But that doesn't change what we did." For the first time in years, neither of them made excuses. Lily spoke next. "I've canceled several parts of the wedding." We all looked at her. "I sold my designer dress. I canceled the fireworks. And I'm paying Mom and Dad back for every dollar they spent from your trust." "You don't have to," I said quietly. "Yes," she replied. "I do. I should have stopped this before it happened." For once, I believed her. A few months later, Ethan and I got married exactly the way we'd planned. A small ceremony overlooking the ocean. Close friends, close family, no unnecessary extravagance. My parents attended. They kept to themselves. They didn't try to make speeches. They didn't ask for forgiveness. They simply showed up. Oddly enough, that meant more than dramatic apologies ever could. Lily came too. Before the ceremony began, she hugged me. "I'm still ashamed of what happened." I hugged her back. "Then spend your life becoming someone who'd never let it happen again." She nodded. "I will."